Hello, everyone. This is Volts for July 24th, 2024. What's up with burning wood pellets for energy? I'm your host, David Roberts. Not a lot of people are aware of this, but over half of what counts as renewable energy in the European Union is bioenergy, i.e. wood pellets burned for heat or electricity. And B, most of those wood pellets come from North American forests, especially in the southeastern U.S. and western Canada. Now the industry is pushing to open new wood pellet facilities in the Pacific Northwest, manufacturing and exporting pellets made from Pacific Northwest wood to the EU and increasingly Asia. Climate and forest activists are pushing back. They say the carbon math on wood pellets doesn't add up. Poor communities suffer the emissions generated by wood burning, and the industry uses more wood from natural forests than it lets on. To get into the details of this faux climate solution, I am talking to Rita Frost of NRDC, who has been involved in conflicts over wood pellets for a decade, and Brenna of 350 PDX, a forest activist. We're going to discuss who makes wood pellets, who uses them, what kinds of emissions they produce, and where they want to expand. All right then, with no further ado, Rita Frost of NRDC and Brenna of 350 PDX, welcome to Volts. Thank you so much for coming.
Thanks so much.
Thanks for having us.
I think I first started thinking I should do something on wood pellets back when I was at Grist like 10 years ago and have been steadily procrastinating on it literally ever since. So this is 10 years of procrastination finally at an end. Rita, I want to start with you. For listeners who are like me and have not paid a ton of attention to this as it has kind of developed in the corner of our eye, maybe just start with telling us, what are wood pellets? How do they make them? And what are they used for?
Utility wood pellets, which commonly they're referred to as wood pellets, even just biomass sometimes, they're a densified biomass fuel that can generate electricity or heating when they're burned, sometimes both. They're small, they're consistent in size, they're wood-derived, compressed cylinders. Mm-hmm. They kind of look like rabbit food. Production, consumption, trade of wood pellets has really grown substantially since the late 2000s, firmly coming onto the scene in the United States in about the past 10 years, all following new policy in the European Union. It was in response to those policies in the past decade that wood pellet production in the U.S. has since grown 500%. The demand is coming from foreign industrial power plants where wood pellets are frequently used for co-firing with or replacement of coal. In other words, I am not focusing on wood pellets used to heat domestic wood stoves in Vermont. They're very cozy, but what we're focusing on here is wood pellet production meant for export markets where they're used in electricity setting. Just to illustrate that point a little bit more finely, let me transport the listener to the north of England, where you will find what used to be the world's largest coal burner called Drax. Now, today, they are the number one burner of forest-derived wood pellets. Drax is huge. They have a generating capacity of nearly 4,000 megawatts. It's the country's largest utility and also regularly joins the top ranks as far as carbon emissions in the country. But that's in England, so what does it have to do with us over here in the United States? Well, it's because back on the home front, the U.S. has become ground zero for wood pellet production. It's driven by European and British policy, but hey, who has a lot of forests? We do in the United States.
So when you say driven by their policy, I assume that just means they have deemed this renewable, and so this is now falling under demand for renewable energy, basically.
Yes, you're hitting the nail on the head. It's from a renewable energy directive. It was first indoctrinated in 2009 for the 2020 period. It has since been re-upped for the 2030 period. And the drivers are all about trying to address climate change. It's about assessing carbon emissions. But Biomass, burning wood pellets, has been politically designated as having the emissions of zero, and they are provided financial support.
Yeah, we'll get into both those later. So you just feed a bunch of wood or wood products into some kind of pressurizer, and it just squeezes them down into tiny little uniform pellets.
I actually love the nuts and bolts because I think that it really gets into the heart of why some of the industry's arguments are fallible. So what happens is that trees are extracted from forests, they're put on trucks, they're transported to these wood pelletization plants. We have about 28 in the southeastern United States. There are a dozen or so more up in Canada. For the roundwood and the tree parts, they are placed into a debarking machine and then cut into chips, which are screened for quality, and waste is removed. That's a really important point because it shows that the standards that are required for wood pelletization are quite high. It's not like these facilities can just take anything and compress it into a pellet.
My impression was very much that you could just kind of throw any sort of waste or scrap or like bark or, twigs or anything in there.
Right. Instead, these pellet facilities really do require clean, uncontaminated chips in order to meet international wood pellet standards. They have expectations and specifications for the wood pellets that go into these utility scale and heat power plants. This includes heat content, moisture, ash, sulfur content, etc. And so because of those very high standards, you can't just scrape the forest floor. No, in fact, what you'll find is that oftentimes these whole trees, whole logs that are going into pellet plants is because they have such high specifications. It's a very intensive energy process to create the wood pellet. And then all in all, at the end of the day, after they go through this huge machine here in the southeastern United States or up in Canada, they are then put onto another vessel, an ocean-going vessel this time, and transported to that power plant, let's use Drax again or otherwise, to be burned and produce electricity.
Mm-hmm. It's funny. The one thing I do remember about wood pellets when this came up is I visited Austria. Good Lord, I don't even remember why. This would have been more than 10 years ago when I worked at Grist. I remember there was a conference at the Sound of Music mansion, the mansion from Sound of Music. I don't know that's a random memory. But one thing I remember is seeing wood pellets. They just deliver these big like truckfuls of wood pellets, and the houses have like these special little doors that basically like on the side of the house that open up, and you just dump the wood pellets in, I guess, to the furnace. So clearly this is a big thing in Europe. So give us kind of a global sense of the trade flows here, like who's making them and where are they going? Is the U.S. the main producer of these things?
So I live in the Pacific Northwest now, but I'm a Southerner. That's where I lived and worked for most of my life. During my time there, I was able to see the growth of this wood pellet industry. The southeastern United States is ground zero for wood pellet production. Nearly 99% of the pellets that are created in the southeastern United States are sent elsewhere.
Oh, wow.
Again, to illustrate this point of how much the Southeast is supplying other places in the world. The United Kingdom is the number one end user of wood pellets in the world. They feed that facility, Drax, in the north of England. 72% of the U.S. wood pellets go to the U.K., and it's a full 7.5 million metric tons.
Wow.
Now, the whole trade flow of the wood pellet industry is quite wide and varied. The United States is the number one wood pellet producer and exporter. Canada, our northern neighbor, is the number 2 wood pellet exporter. Many of those do go to the EU, and then some of those actually go.
That's Western Canada, right? Like
yes. British Columbia for the most part. Yep. And they're feeding Japan and South Korea. Then also heading over to Asia, Vietnam is a major wood pellet producer. And Eastern Europe is a major wood pellet producer. Estonia, Romania, Latvia. These are big wood pellet producers of the world. They are mostly focusing on a nexus of facilities in the European Union. The United Kingdom, I'm going to separate out here because of Brexit. But then following that, the next top importers of wood pellets are the Netherlands, Denmark, Belgium. Heading back over to Southeast Asia, the biggest importers there are South Korea and Japan, and they are quickly rising to become some of the biggest players.
I was going to say, is this like everything else where Asian demand is rapidly growing and is going to eventually dominate everything else?
Asian demand is rapidly growing, and it looks like copy and paste of the policies that started in the European Union and in the United Kingdom.
Interesting. So they're mainly centered in in the North American context, in the Southeast and way up in the Northwest in British Columbia. But all this expansion of demand is leading to expansion of supply. So Brenna, maybe you could tell us about what the wood pellet industry is proposing in terms of production facilities here in our beloved Pacific Northwest.
Sure. And I'll just say I always learn so much listening to Rita. I am new to the biomass world. I come from forest protection, forest defense, and that's been my focus for a very long time. And, I looked on to all of my coworkers and allies who were trying to stop energy exports on the West Coast. And I was like, you go, that's amazing. That will never be what I do as a forest activist. And so...
Well, we should pause there just to make sense of that for listeners. Where we're talking about here, Longview up in northern Washington, there's been like LNG export terminal proposed and some other, there's been a bunch of different attempts to make that a big energy exporter, all of which, unless I'm mistaken, have failed thus far. Am I right? There's nothing there yet.
Yeah, Longview is actually in southern Washington. It's on the Columbia River, and the Columbia River has long been looked at for energy export.
Right.
So there have been several different proposals along the Columbia. There was a proposed methane export plant, 2 LNG export plants.
Right.
All have been stopped. We call it the thin green line. None shall pass. Also people down in southern Oregon were working to stop the Jordan Cove liquefied natural gas export plant, and all of those stopped. And at the same time, I should say, there's been this, forest movement in the Northwest that has been very active since the 70s in protecting forests and old growth, and is still active. And it's kind of a chance, in some way, as a movement-oriented person, I'm excited about the chance for the two to come together and work. That said, it's not fun to have to put a ton of one's own time and energy into stopping a proposal that makes literally no sense for forests or for climate.
Isn't that the life of most environmentalists? You chose this, Brenna.
I know, it's true. But with that, kind of with that context, what we've been looking at is the expansion of the biomass industry into the Pacific Northwest and also into Northern California. The ones I'm most familiar with are the ones in Washington. I work out of Portland, and so they're the closest ones. And the company that Rita talked about, Drax, this large biomass burner in England, is now looking, in their words, to expand their fiber baskets. They want a new fiber basket. They have identified the Pacific Northwest.
That means forests, right?
Exactly.
Right.
It's just their corporate term for we need more lumber.
Right.
And in British Columbia, they bought a group called Pinnacle Holdings, which was a small-scale producer of wood pellets, and they have made it a large-scale producer. And now Pinnacle Holdings has come to Longview and is working diligently to start a new production and export facility on the Columbia River in Longview. And their sourcing area, where they would take wood from, is very large. So that would go over into Oregon, be all throughout the Cascades in Oregon and Washington. And there's another plant that's slightly farther along in Hoquiam, which is right on the kind of the south central coast in Washington, that also would have a very large sourcing radius. So we're looking at these overlapping plants who want to take more of our forests. And as Rita said, this is not a bunch of byproducts. This is not like the scrap, the slash that's left over from logging, the stuff that typically gets burned in a old timber sale. That's not that.
Let's talk about this because they say
it is that.
It is. That if you go look at the videos and stuff on their website, this is precisely what they're saying, is that they're going to, and this is a big part of the sustainability claims, I think, is that they're going to use waste products. So is that just flatly false? Are they also using waste products, or they literally are not using waste products and they're just lying about it?
Well, I will defer to Rita on that fact, the last factual question. But I think a thing that most of us have learned about energy companies is they do lie.
What?
So it's not going to come as a shock.
Here's the thing. You can dig into either investigative journalism reports by the Wall Street Journal, CNN, BBC, Channel 4 in the UK, others globally who have gone into the field with watchdog organizations and found that the industry does source from sensitive habitat, natural forests, in many cases, especially well documented in Canada, old growth forests. Or instead of believing investigative journalists, you can look at industry documents and research that reflect that a majority of wood pellet feedstock comes from trees and tree parts, and a small amount actually comes from forestry residues, aka waste. The numbers back this up. Almost 90% of wood pellets come from the main stems of trees, mostly of pulpwood quality or from sawdust otherwise used for wood products. This is why we still see large debris piles left to decay and or be burnt in harvest sites that pellet facilities are sourcing from the Southeast. This is why we still see air quality that is just as bad in burning season after wood pellet plants set up shop in BC as before they were established. We see a very consistent trend in the sourcing regions where the wood pellet industry operates. Logging increases its reach and it gets worse.
Yeah. If what they said was true, there would be no slash piles.
Yeah. And I guess what I was going to ask is it possible, like if they wanted to, is there enough waste and slash piles to satisfy the kind of quantity of demand we're talking about?
No. I mean, the new Longview facility would require 1 million tons of wood per year. Per year.
And there's just not that much slash.
There's not that much else. And if there was that much slash, I'd be worried that there was too much logging.
Right.
Right? Like if we were generating 1 million tons per year in byproduct slash, like that would massively ramp up the amount of logging that was happening. And so either way you go about it, it's net loss for our forests. And this is why, like as a forest and climate activist, we decided to get involved in these biomass fights because, you know, we've recently been learning how important forests are as carbon sinks and stores. And the forests of the Northwest are some of the best ecosystems in the world at carbon storing. And so the last thing we should be doing is cutting them down and burning them and releasing all that stored carbon into the atmosphere.
And this is, Rita, is this my impression, you know, coming from knowing very little about any of this, but my vague impression of the southeastern forests is that there isn't much original forest left down there, and they're mostly just industrial forests, whereas in the Northwest, original forest is a much more prominent concern. Is that fair?
It's complicated. Europeans did a really great job of cutting a lot of forests as they moved westward across the United States. Policy did a good job of trying to catch up and protect places before it was too late, I would say, in the Western United States. However, no matter where you look in the United States, we have very little old growth forest left, primable forest, primary forests that have literally never been cut. That's pretty rare across the United States, no matter where you're looking. But the important piece is the wood pellet industry is sourcing from natural forests. So what we would call natural forest would be anything that is going to be naturally regenerated. It wasn't planted. It's not necessarily an industrial pine plantation. Yes, there are a lot of industrial pine plantations in the southeastern United States, and that is a problem in and of itself. However, the wood pellet biomass industry is still sourcing from a lot of natural forests in the southeast. In fact, the very first investigative journalism piece ever done on the biomass industry was in Virginia, where the industry was found sourcing from over 100-year-old wetland forest in Virginia. That was a bottomland hardwood forest. It's what's considered a natural forest in that area. And then even up to 2022 or 2023, there was another investigation that Channel 4 in the UK came over from the UK to do in the southern United States and found a similar story of a clear cut of a bottomland hardwood forest in North Carolina that again was over 100 years old. So they're not necessarily primable, they're not necessarily virgin. That doesn't mean that they're not very critically important for the qualities that we're looking for, which is biodiversity and climate.
Right. So I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but one wonders, like, these companies say, hey, we're just using farmed forests, and like some investigative journalist comes over from the UK, wanders out into the forest and looks and says, hey, no, they're not. So like, it seems like someone else ought to be doing that. Is there who's the governing body here? Is there is there a law enforcement agency here? Is it like, why, like, is there any, if I'm Drax, is there anyone that I fear at all looking over my shoulder at all?
Oh, yeah. And you better believe that the auditors are on their tail. The UK Audit Committee has looked into Drax and wood pellet sourcing. In fact, policies can change at any time on any day. In fact, earlier this month, July 2024, the Netherlands, which, as I mentioned before, is one of the top importers of wood pellets in the world, they ended all biomass subsidies for electricity with more restrictions expected. And this is primarily coming back to the fact that these investigations have time and again proven that it's not like finding a needle in a haystack when you go to the forests of the southern United States and follow the wood pellet industry. In fact, they have shown that despite excessive logging pressure that is already undermining forest resilience, that wood is becoming really increasingly scarce and precious, and that governmental restrictions on wood burning incentives are really welcome, expected to multiply even. So these policies are policies on paper. They're just like any other. And they definitely don't reflect the emissions that are going into the atmosphere, nor do they reflect the picture on the ground of what's happening to forests. So I would say that it is emerging with these policies being overturned. And on the other side, if I was going to play devil's advocate to my arguments that I'm proposing here, wood pellet biomass and biomass in general in the European Union is a full 60% of what they classify as renewable energy.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that. It's crazy. Yeah. It's crazy. It's a huge part of the quote unquote renewable energy picture over there.
Yeah. And that goes into their image on a global level. It goes into their commitments for the Paris Climate Accord.
And they have a declining cap over there. They got the trading system. There's actually policy there. So just to sort of point out the obvious here, if the EU as a whole were to say tomorrow, we made a mistake, wood pellets are not renewable, wood is not renewable, at a stroke, the amount of renewable energy that the EU is using would fall by 60%, basically. Like they would look way farther behind in the clean energy race than they are. Like is that kind of the political situation?
Yeah, I mean, politically, it's very sensitive. However, more important than politics is the fact that our climate is hitting a tipping point, and we need to have accurate accounting to be able to provide an accurate picture to the public as well as other policymakers about how to right-size this problem. And no matter what, I think when it comes to wood pellet biomass, it's not a technology that is becoming more efficient or cheaper. In fact, wind and solar, other renewable energy technologies are far cheaper. It would go away. It would go away. If those policies were right-sized and they eliminated the perverse incentives, there wouldn't be an industry that could stand alone by itself.
Yeah, that's actually another question I was going to ask, which is this an industry that has more or less been created by policy and subsidies? And if the policies and subsidies went away, it couldn't survive freestanding.
Absolutely. NRDC commissioned a report in 2022 that found that about 12 European countries, we really looked at it holistically, they spent more than $7.5 billion in subsidies for biomass electricity generation, combined heat and power. And that was a 27% increase between 2015 and 2020. It's getting more expensive for them to do it. It's not getting cheaper. The UK itself subsidizes the biomass industry to the tune of almost $2 billion a year. It's a cost to energy bill payers that are being told it's emissions-free power when it couldn't be further from the truth.
Well, let's talk about that then. Let's talk about the carbon math. So the industry story is pretty simple, which is the tree grows, it absorbs carbon dioxide. You cut the tree down, make it into pellets and burn it. You release that carbon dioxide. But meanwhile, you planted a new tree that is growing and absorbing carbon dioxide. So basically, the carbon dioxide you release when you burn these things was absorbed previously, so it's carbon neutral. That's the story. Like, we're not introducing new carbon to the atmosphere, we're just cycling carbon. That's the zero emissions story. And that is the one that, like, I interviewed Jay Inslee, governor of Washington, on this pod just a couple of weeks ago. That's the story he tells. That's the story that supportive policymakers tell, which is that this is carbon neutral. The carbon we're releasing is just carbon that was previously absorbed, et cetera. In reality, things are much more complicated. Maybe Brenna, as a forest person, you could tell us a little bit about why that math is not as simple as it looks.
Sure. I mean, I think all of this is a question of time scale, because we could say about fossil fuels, the carbon that they're releasing is just carbon that they absorbed.
Yeah, millions of years ago. It's carbon neutral.
Right, and so it's carbon neutral.
All carbon is carbon neutral.
Exactly. You could, if you extend that argument out, it falls apart really quickly. I think that the big concern, like why we're so worried about the growth of this industry, especially, like as Rita was saying, all those subsidies, those are subsidies that are not going into technologies that actually are carbon neutral. So they're perpetuating this like burning energy economy that is putting these things into the air now. The worry is there's too much carbon in the atmosphere now, right? We're at 421 parts per million. And scientists have said we would have a stable climate at 350 parts per million of carbon. So we're way overshot. So adding any more now, like we're not talking about the future tree's ability to absorb the carbon that's emitted, because we have to look at there's already too much. So that's one thing, is like what we need to do is decrease emissions in the moment, because we've already far overshot what we can have for a stable climate. So that's kind of the first concern about this.
Even if the story was true, the carbon absorbed would come
in the future.
Decades later than the carbon.
Exactly.
And there's a time value to carbon here.
I guess the time value of carbon is what's really important to look at. And also, there's no guarantee that there will be a tree planted.
Right. That's my thing. Like, we don't know. Like, how do we know? Come on.
This story would be true, say, if the company that wanted to emit the carbon now planted trees to absorb it some 50 years ago. And they were ready to do the job now, right? So there is a way in which this story could be sustainable on a different scale of time, and if we weren't always so worried about the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. But what we're doing, again, and not only that, I should say, is we're not only releasing the stored carbon, we're removing that tree's ability to continue sequestering carbon. So we're taking a large tree full of carbon, and we're emitting that in the atmosphere, and then all of that storage capacity is leaving the forest. We might plant a new tree, and that sapling might sequester carbon at a really quick rate, but it can't store it, right? So it's just like continuing to sequester, but the carbon's going back into the atmosphere, and we've lost all that storage. So in many different ways, there is a net loss of carbon on the land and a net gain of carbon in the atmosphere, which is the opposite of what we want right now.
Right. And this is all just assuming that you like knock the tree down over and put it directly into a plant. But like you got to go harvest the trees.
Right.
You got to
manufacture the pellets.
Carry the trees, manufacture the pellets, ship it all the way across.
Overseas.
Like that's a huge. And then so like, do we know like numbers wise how much additional carbon is added just by all the process around it?
Yes. So first on the carbon payback period for wood pellet biomass coming from forests, it's going to be a 44 to 100-year carbon payback period. Don't think that we have those sorts of timeframes on our side. And then secondly, when it comes down to comparative emissions, published scientific studies have told us that burning biomass for power emits about 20% more carbon than coal. That is a very, very, very conservative number, and 3 times the amount produced by a natural gas plant per kilowatt of electricity.
Yeah, so just like putting the accounting aside, putting, whatever happened to the tree previously and whatever happened to future trees aside, just burning the stuff is incredibly carbon intensive. More so than fossil fuels.
When a bunch of climate activists say, we'd rather have you burn coal, there's a problem there.
I'll bring us back to Drax in the north of England. They're formerly the largest coal burner in the world, but they've converted all their massive boilers to be burning forest-derived biomass. Still, Drax is the UK Power's single largest carbon dioxide emitter, despite only providing 4 to 6% of the total UK electricity supply.
Oh, wow. So do they get dinged for that in the EU's, trading system, or is it all getting counted as carbon neutral?
All of it gets counted as a big whopping 0.
That's crazy.
Yes,
Mm-hmm.
they have to count the emissions from the transport emissions, but when it comes to actually burning it at the smokestack, that looks like a zero on the UK's accounting books.
Are there more and less dirty ways to burn them, just in terms of the actual burning and power production? Like, are there more and less clean plants, or is a wood burning plant a wood burning plant, more or less? Hey there, everybody. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell you about a new mattress or push a credit card on you. This isn't an ad. There are no ads on Volts. It is supported entirely by listeners like you. If you'll indulge me for a second, I'd like to ask for your support. I started Volts because we're all surrounded by depressing news about climate change and misinformation about clean energy, and it's never been more important to share the stories of the real people on the ground doing the real work of transition, and all the ingenuity and courage and public spirit they are bringing to it. People are hungry to hear these stories, to learn from and find inspiration in them. I've heard from people who changed majors or careers after hearing episodes of Volts, people using it in classrooms and community groups, even state legislators who have passed bills inspired by specific episodes. Sharing these stories matters. It makes a difference. If you have found value in it and want to help me continue doing it, I hope you will join the community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf. It's about the cost of a cup of coffee a month. If you don't like subscriptions, you can make a one-time contribution, leave a review on Apple or Spotify, or just tell a friend about Volts. I am grateful for any and all support. If you're already a paid subscriber, thank you. And now, back to the show. Are there more and less clean plants, or is a wood-burning plant a wood-burning plant, more or less?
I would say that a wood-burning plant is a wood-burning plant, just on the whole. One of the things that I will say is that when it comes to bioenergy, there are other emissions here besides just carbon that are incredibly concerning for communities.
I mean, carbon's like, I guess, our main thing we're worried about here, the carbon math, and it's sort of the faulty carbon math that is sustaining this entire industry. But obviously, when you burn these things, more than just carbon is produced. So tell us a little bit about what those other sort of air and water impacts are, and importantly, who is suffering those other impacts.
Mm-hmm. So I will focus mostly on pellet mills in the United States because that is what I'm familiar with, and that's what I've worked on for almost 10 years. But I'll also say that the emissions that are coming out of bioenergy facilities are so bad that the American Lung Association is vocally opposed to woody biomass production and combustion because there are amount of emissions. I mean, ask anybody who lives in the Central Valley of California where there are 18 bioenergy facilities. They have some of the worst air quality in the world, and it is coming from those bioenergy facilities themselves. But placing us back with the pellet mills where pellets are created, again, exported elsewhere to be used, they are disproportionately harming vulnerable communities that are already suffering from other environmental injustices. And they emit harmful levels of air pollutants that include soot, nitrogen oxides, carbon monoxide, volatile organic compounds.
Wait, this is the manufacturing part?
Mm-hmm.
The making of them? Where is all that coming from? When the wood just gets squished together, I guess I'm wondering where all that other stuff comes from.
Yes. Wood has a lot of toxic compounds in it that come out during the very energy intensive process of creating the pellets themselves. They are so dirty that these plants are repeatedly exceeding air pollution limits. To give you two examples, in the very environmentally friendly states of Louisiana and Mississippi, those states have given fines to Drax, which manufactures wood pellets there, at the tune of $2.5 million and $3.2 million in Louisiana for breaking the Clean Air Act and polluting the air of small rural towns. This is not really unique in the United States either. There was a report that was released 2 months ago this year in May that found that Drax's pellet mills in Canada violated Canada environmental law 189 times. Infringements included polluting rivers, lakes with industrial waste, destroying wetlands, but the vast majority of the violations, over 180 of them, consisted of non-compliance with air permit rules.
So that's the production side then, is filthy in terms of particulate pollution, nitrogen oxides, things like that. What about the burning side? Is the burning side more or less polluting than than the manufacturer side.
The burning side is also very dirty. I'm not as familiar with it because I haven't worked with those communities in those foreign contexts as much. But I do know that in the United Kingdom, there have been air pollution concerns around Drax's facility in the north of England. It's a complicated matter because it's a small community. A lot of the jobs are with the Drax facility.
Same with coal, of course.
Yep. However, it's been bad enough that I know that there have been lawsuits that have gone after Drax, and workers have been willing to raise their voices about the air pollution concerns that they have too in working in the facility.
And that's environmental justice on that side too, since I'm assuming there, as here, these big power plants will tend to be in poorer communities. Mm-hmm. One of the things that is part of the debate over doing this in the Pacific Northwest, one of the claims I actually saw, I mean, we kind of touched on this earlier, but one of the claims I saw is that they are going to help prevent forest fires because they are going to gather up all this waste wood and snags and all this stuff that's been left by insufficient sort of forest, clearing in previous years. Is there anything to that, Brenna? Is that just nonsense, or is there basis for that?
I think that comes back to that earlier question of where biomass is sourced from. As Rita pointed out, as far as we can tell, most of the wood in biomass production comes from the trunk of the tree. It comes from the stem. That's been shown in the Southeast where they've done it. Up in Canada, the BBC found that Drax is logging actual native old-growth forests and then leaving behind the slash piles that they're burning. And so in order to get to the argument that they're helping, take the slash and the byproducts that otherwise might lead to, a higher degree of fire, I think that that's pretty much countered by what their practices are, and that the fact that they're taking full trees. I know that in Oregon, one of our federal senators, Senator Merkley, who's a climate champion, kind of like Jay Inslee, is very pro-biomass for this fire reason. And I mean, there's also a lot of science around the fact that logging and fuels reduction and opening up the canopy might actually not have the result that they want in case of fire. So there's a lot going on there around whether or not logging generally helps reduce the risk of fire, catastrophic fire. But what we know is this industry is not going to be our savior around that. We know that they will come and they will be doing more large-scale clear cuts and cutting both plantations and native forest. And definitely that will not help with the increase in fire that we're seeing as a result of a changing climate.
Everybody I talk to, and of course, I live in my bubble, just like everybody lives in their bubble. So of course, like most people I know are against this. Like everybody I've asked about it is against it. And this includes just like sort of normies. I threw this out on Twitter earlier for questions about it. And everybody, I think, whether you really are like familiar with the details of the industry or not, everybody's just like, no. Mm-hmm. No, don't do that. Like it's just obvious. No, obviously that's bad. And it seems to be that the science on the carbon doesn't hold up very well. There's all these pollution issues. There's all these environmental justice issues. Who's suffering this pollution? And this is an industry that's not like they're as big as coal or fossil fuels. It's not like they're a giant industry. I guess I'm just wondering, like, how is it that this industry has these otherwise excellent politicians in their pocket, and they've got this whole thing, they've got this whole giant industry up and running and growing based on pretty provable false claims. Just like, how are they pulling this off? I guess is my question. Like, the industry does not seem big and powerful enough that it ought to be able to be pulling off a scam of this scale. So like, what am I missing in terms of the political economy here?
Well, I'll start and then pass it to Rita, because as I said, I am also new to this. So one of the things I've done over the past almost year is a lot of public education, both for myself, the organization that I work for, our volunteers. None of us really knew much about biomass. And what we found, David, is very similar to what you're finding. So we relied a lot on resources from the Southeast, from the Dogwood Alliance especially, who is just deep in this work. And we showed their movie Burned, Are Trees the New Coal, which is fantastic, and started getting the word out. And every time we talked to someone, they're like, are you kidding? Like, how is this a thing? How is this something that is a thing and growing? Like that same kind of like cognitive disconnect.
Yeah.
I have not yet talked to anyone, and granted, it might be a self-selecting crew, who's like, oh yeah, this is what we need to solve climate change,
yeah,
right? We need to cut down our forests, ship them overseas, and burn them for energy. And as to your query, like I think honestly, in terms of the Northwest senators, and I'd like Rita to speak more broadly politically, but here, I think what we're seeing is the result of years of the timber industry really holding sway.
Right.
And they love this story.
Of course they do. I mean, it's like a breath of, it's like a whole new lease on life.
I know. It's kind of like they love the log it so it doesn't burn narrative. What I'm hoping, because I might still have a tiny bit of delusional optimism, is that what's happening with people like Senator Merkley and Governor Inslee is they don't yet understand the scale shift that's happening. Like we've had small scale biomass burning in Oregon as long as there's been a timber industry. People have been co-firing with wood waste and seeing that as a positive thing. This idea that there are byproducts from logging that could be used locally to generate energy, like that is an okay story. That's not what we're talking about.
We should say here that like if you're just burning wood pellets for heat,
yes,
it is better than logs, right? Or like charcoal or whatever. Like it is better than some of the heating alternatives.
Yeah. And it's a question of scale. I think perhaps they haven't caught up to. We're not talking about using byproduct of thinning, like a restoration thinning project to use locally in like a cogen plant.
Yeah.
Senator Merkley loves that.
Yeah, we do love cogen plants here on
Right,
Volts.
but what we're talking about is this export-based industry, and we're trying to educate them. I mean, we've had several meetings with their staff and are saying, hey, do you see this? Do you see that this is a different thing than the thing that you've been behind? And it has real severe climate impacts and community impacts and forest impacts. As of yet, they're not there. And I think that there is a moment now to really do a lot of political education and pressure to move them, because the industry does not have a foothold in the Northwest yet.
Yeah,
it does not have a foothold in Northern California. And we need, from what we've learned from our friends in the Southeast, we need to keep it out, because once it's here, it will be much, much harder.
Rita, expand on that a little bit. What's the political economy? I guess in the Southeast, it makes more sense to me since forestry goes way back there. Environmental concern maybe is not as deep-rooted, but just like, is there political controversy over it in the Southeast?
Yeah. So when we're talking about the political controversy, it's interesting for me because it's not so much explicit as it is implicit. These are policy and cultural environments in the United States that, for the most part, are pretty okay with logging. There aren't that many restrictions on what logging can go for, if that makes sense. We don't put restrictions on that. And we especially don't put restrictions on folks in the Southeast where 90% of the forests are owned by private landowners. With the real policy disconnect is what's happening in Europe and the UK and South Korea and Japan. You know, it's
the political economy in Europe is somewhat mysterious to me. On the one hand, I get that, like, as you say, it's 60% of renewable energy there. And so in some sense, the entire global reputation of the EU as a progressive jurisdiction on climate kind of depends on this. So I can see that kind of pressure. But on the other hand, they also seem to sincerely care about climate. And this isn't that. So like, It's a little mysterious to me there too.
Well,
what's going on there?
There's one more piece about that, right? Which is that let's look at Drax yet again. My favorite example of this conversation.
I love that they have a name that sounds so evil. It sounds like like an evil organization in James Bond or something.
Yeah, like a Disney villain or something like that,
Exactly.
But who is the world's biggest end user of biomass? Drax, the world's largest former coal operator. Drax has a lot of money. So when other players that are coal utilities in Europe saw these policies coming down the pike, saw that they could make very minor technological switches to their facilities to keep their coal facilities online, this is a lifeline to coal companies.
Yeah, it's like the smallest possible change you could make right in the name of climate.
With very wealthy, very rich, very resourced players. They have been around for a long time. They have a lot of political capital. Drax is in the pocket of a lot of UK policymakers. Coal executives everywhere in the world are in the pockets of a lot of policymakers.
Yeah.
So that is the political calculation here that we're really talking about. And the interesting thing, as we touched on previously in this conversation, is that it shouldn't be a transition fuel. It shouldn't be a lifeline to coal facilities. Every dollar that goes to burning biomass is a dollar that could be going to truly emissive-free sources that are actually tackling the problem of climate change. So this is a reckoning. Just like anything else that the world is doing in trying to tackle climate change, this is a reckoning about transparency, accountability, and being really honest with ourselves about how we're going to protect communities. At the end of the day, the communities that are having their forests extracted from them, the communities that are having air pollution in their own air systems over in the United Kingdom and or elsewhere, as well as the world that is facing more climate change-induced disasters.
But in terms of the communities, though, I should just say, like, I'm sure there's a lot of community-based opposition to this stuff, but I also suspect that there's a lot of community support for it, just because it's a lot of money, a lot of industry.
You'd be hard-pressed to find it.
Really?
After working with these communities for about 9 years, the truth usually comes to the fore, which is that the industry, I'm talking about wood pellet manufacturing. Let me be frank about my experience, right? But they promise wealth. They promise jobs. It's all snake oil. The only thing that the facilities are sure to deliver is poisoned air, increased traffic, to cut down forests here, to pollute eventually in power plants halfway across the world. The economic development numbers don't pan out. In fact, in one of the communities in North Carolina that has had a wood pellet facility for the longest, it's one of the original communities that has had a wood pellet facility, their poverty rate has actually increased since the wood pellet manufacturing facility opened its door. These aren't facilities or industries that bring about enough economic development or jobs that are going to change a community's outcome.
Interesting. So this is not that kind of dilemma, because we do face that kind of dilemma in a lot of places, like with coal communities, like coal's dirty, coal's killing them, they're in poverty, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but they still rally around their coal plants because there's just not much else. So you're saying it's not as dug in as that, maybe, is the way to put it.
It's not as dug in, even though they would like to become politically entrenched.
I wonder, you said the Netherlands recently sort of woke up, let's say, to this, or got serious about this and decided, we can't go on with this farce that biomass is carbon neutral. Is that the tip of a spear? Is that a sign of things to come? Like, which way do you see the wind blowing in Europe?
Yeah, that's what we're looking for. One of the other top importers that I named was Denmark. The Netherlands and Denmark are sister countries of sorts. Mm-hmm. They follow each other's leads. I think that this is going to send a very strong signal to Denmark. And then the other important political change to note is that we have a new government in the United Kingdom.
Yes, I was going to bring that up. Things have changed in the UK recently.
Things have changed in the UK. And furthermore, there are two very important decisions in the policy sphere around biomass going forward. One is around subsidies post-2027 in the UK context. And then one is for subsidies for bioenergy carbon capture storage, otherwise known as BECCS.
BECCS, yes.
That is firmly in the hands of the new Labour government. Mm-hmm. The tides have shifted. We will see if this spells ruin for the bioenergy industry.
Is there any BECCS? There's no BECCS. Is there? Is there an actual BECCS in the world?
It's a bit of a unicorn, huh?
Yeah, I mean, I hear about it, and boy, there's a ton of it in models. if you look in the models, there's just like gigatons, gigawatts.
Yeah, you'll find it all over the papers, right?
Are any wood pellet burning facilities capturing their carbon and sequestering it, to your knowledge?
Gosh, not that I know of yet. I know that Drax would like to develop one. Drax also has proposals to do that here in the United States. So they are trying to pit the UK government versus the US government to see where they can find a more favorable policy environment to build a BECCS facility. But here's the thing, even assuming that all of the combustion emissions could be captured at the power plant stat, which is very overly optimistic. Forest-derived BECCS cannot capture a large proportion of the carbon that is emitted before the wood pellet fuel reaches a power plant, right? This is something we've already talked about in this conversation. Producing wood pellets for power plants requires cutting down trees, transport, drying the wood, turning the wood into pellets, transporting the pellets.
Drying the wood is worth calling out here just a little bit. Like drying the wood, it's not something I knew before looking into this, but drying the wood is actually quite an energy intensive piece of this.
Very energy intensive, and they're frequently either burning fossil fuels or they're burning wood.
It's burning fossil fuels to dry wood to have renewable energy is just a chef's kiss of a chef's kiss of a loop there. Brenna, the Forest Service recently put out an assessment of old growth or something like that, which is, from my understanding, biomass sympathetic, more so than you might want from the Forest Service. What's going on there?
Yeah, the Forest Service is actually in the midst of evaluating, amending all the forest plans for all national forests in the country to protect old growth, which stems from President Biden's executive order on old growth, asking this rulemaking to happen. And it's something that's been watched with a lot of cautious optimism. The Forest Service is not well known for making good decisions for the environment. That's as someone who's beat my head against them for a very long time. But we thought, the direction is pretty clear. Like the president's executive order recognized the old growth forests are essential for climate resilience, for carbon storage, are an important habitat, they're important for water. So we said, what's going to come out of this? And the draft environmental impact statement that came out, their proposed approach left a lot to be desired because there are still, as we say, loopholes large enough to drive logging trucks through. Because it sets it up, says, well, we're going to protect old growth unless it's necessary to log it for forest health, unless it's necessary to log it for fuels reduction.
And as we've demonstrated, they're always claiming that it's for that. I mean,
they really are. And we could talk at length about the different euphemisms that the Forest Service makes to justify logging. And so, they're like, well, maybe logging it could end up being a good thing because then we could use the byproduct for biomass and just kind of, it wasn't even necessary because like Rita said, there's not usually control over where logged trees go. So they didn't need to talk about that as one of the places that anything that comes out of the forest would be. But it's just getting woven into these narratives.
Not to be Debbie Downer here, but I guess we should at least say that this is under a Biden Forest Service, right? Which is like, in our crap world we live in, the best we could probably hope for. And should just say that it's very likely that if Trump wins and is in charge of the Forest Service, that any restraint on these matters will go out the window.
Most of them don't pay much attention to it, and the Forest Service is still dominated by timber targets and the industry.
Right.
But honestly, most of the logs, like in the Southeast, almost exclusively, in the Northwest, still the majority of our logs do come from private land that is far less regulated than our federal and state forests.
Yeah, true.
Right? And so I honestly don't think that even if we get these biomass plants in the Northwest, they're going to be doing old growth logging. Those trees are too valuable to be being shipped to burn. But I do think we're going to see an uptick in clear cutting on private lands where there's far less regulation than there is now. And that has its own impact on the communities and the climate.
And quickly, EPA is doing something right now, some sort of review of something. What am I thinking about?
Is it in relation to wood pellets?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well,
I mean, obviously they're doing lots of things, but on this subject.
yes. So, I mean, I think one of the interesting things here, we talked about all the violations of air permits. We talked about the environmental justice impacts. Well, the U.S. EPA is responding. The U.S. EPA is moving forward on a study of the impacts of the wood pellet industry, including scrutinizing the state permitting and enforcement processes because they have been so poor. Because at any given time, you can look at wood pellet facilities across the United States, and about a third of them are in non-compliance. They are looking at an epidemiological study. This is really important to the communities that live with wood pellet facilities because of all those air pollution impacts that I've mentioned. Furthermore, it's not just the EPA, it's not just the administrative side of our government. There has been policy introduced in both the Senate and the House of Congress that is meant to both direct the EPA to assess the life cycle greenhouse gas emissions associated with forest biomass, as well as study the impact of the industry on communities. That's called the Forest Biomass Emissions Act of 2024.
Has the EPA never done a real comprehensive study of the carbon cycle involved in wood pellets?
So when it comes to the emissions associated with forest biomass as well as combustion, that is within the EPA's purview. But every single year, every single congressional session, what we see is the industry ask the US EPA to deem that biomass is carbon neutral. Very similar language to what's in the EU and the UK. And so because of that, this act that was introduced is supposed to be just affirming what already is the case, which is that that authority lies with the EPA. We do not want Congress to be mandating whether biomass is carbon neutral or not. We've seen how deleterious that is from the EU and the UK.
But now we don't want courts to do it either, since our courts are all screwed up. There's no one left. There's no one left to do it. So it sounds like, in terms of political economy, it sort of sounds like, on the one hand, the industry is expanding and got big plans for expansion. But on the other hand, it sounds like it is kind of standing on a thin branch of policy that does not seem super sturdy and predictable. Like it does seem like it wouldn't take much good policy for this industry to just go away. Like it really seems like anything could happen here. This is not a juggernaut. Like it's, you know what I mean? It's more vulnerable, I guess, than I had gotten the impression going in.
It definitely feels like the forests in the US could be really, really heavily impacted by the decisions in the UK.
Yeah.
And there are a lot of people in the UK who are working on this. And the Southeast has made alliances. I know they've been sending people back and forth for a long time. Now we in the Northwest are starting to get to know them and starting to all work together globally to think like the point of production and the point of burning are in different places, but we're all impacted by it.
Yeah.
And our governments are all supporting it right now. And so trying to build a bit more of a cohesive international movement, or rather, I should say there has been. We in the Northwest are newcomers to this international movement to stop this. And I don't want it to stop. Just like if we keep these plants out of Longview, out of Hoquiam, out of Northern California, I think I want to stay in the fight because this, false climate solutions are kind of the next frontier that we as climate justice activists need to look at. Because capitalism is not going to go down easy. And it's going to keep thinking, how can I just make a tweak and keep making money at the expense of communities?
But as a running dog capitalist sympathizer, let me just say that an industry that exists entirely by virtue of supportive regulation and subsidies is not really the textbook definition of capitalism. Like this is something that public policy created in a lot of ways, and which means, I guess, if you want to look at it in the optimistic sense, that public policy could just as easily uncreate it, right? Do away with it. So, final question then, flat out then, if I'm in Japan, say, or one of these sort of, because I think the places where these wood pellets are going are places that feel constrained in terms of their other renewable energy choices. And I guess if like I'm living next to a coal plant in Japan that's making coal power, Is wood pellets better than coal? I mean, I know that's such an incredibly, incredibly low bar for anything to clear, but just like at the very base level, is this at least better than coal?
I would say that there are other options, and I almost feel like that's a false dilemma. It's a false choice. I think that when it comes to the immediacy of the climate crisis, that demands a rapid pivot away from using anything that increases emissions. And what we have shown and what scientists are very much crying out and saying is that using wood as fuel increases emissions. It also means that we have foregone sequestration when we lose our forests on the landscape.
Yeah.
And then furthermore, communities where the energy is produced or the wood pellet is produced, they're harmed. So when it comes down to it, biomass burning for electricity fails the land test. It fails any meaningful standards for lessening greenhouse gas emissions, and it's sacrificing our communities.
Well, that sounds like a great way to wrap up this grim subject. I'm so glad I finally did this. I'm so glad you two came on to help me through this. Thank you both for your expertise and for your work.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to Volts. It takes a village to make this podcast work. Shout out especially to my super producer, Kyle McDonald, who makes my guests and I sound smart every week. And it is all supported entirely by listeners like you. So if you value conversations like this, please consider joining our community of paid subscribers at volts.wtf, or leaving a nice review, or telling a friend about Volts, or all three. Thanks so much, and I'll see you next time.